also
We could switch one of these out.
to be near to the speaker so I can hear.
Yeah.
Okay.
Christ, it's falling apart.
One thing at a time, right?
All with good humor.
Yeah, right.
Thank you, my dear.
Mm-hmm.
So did you come do your cookies early, just so you...
Yes, just so I could be here on time.
So you know what?
You remember Tom?
Of course.
I didn't-
I used to spend time in what's now the kitchen, was a classroom years ago. It's one of the years I had you as a teacher.
Teacher?
When you were
back when that was the library.
Well, when you were 14.
Yeah, probably about then.
Yeah. I didn't mean to be talking ages here, but I think it was when you were in 9th grade.
Yeah, I think it was. It was right before high school, yeah.
We were communicating.
I can't remember exactly the topics that year. But I remember it was a good conversation, that's for sure. After you, I had Warren Busing in high school.
Oh, boy.
Just as interesting.
Yeah. Quite a fine gentleman.
They don't have real classes
Barely
like
understand.
that.
How you doing?
Good.
Good. How about you? I'm good,
They have
thanks.
a general group, but do they go into classes?
I think so.
Sure.
Puppy dog.
I did more videos than I used to be, probably.
And Tom must have had all you guys, Jeff Liederbach and Paul
Sure.
Schreiber and Becky Miller.
Oh, boy.
Where do you girls go to school?
Here in Wauwatosa. I've got one at
I
Jefferson
had the privilege
and
of
one at Longfellow, so 7th grade and 4th grade.
working with those 9th graders for 7 years. Yeah.
We,
But,
we did our research and shows through Wauwatosa, first because of the school,
you
second
bet.
because of the
Wonderful group, and I still have a lot of them that
Where do you live?
I remember them and they
on
remember me.
67th Street between Denton and Wisconsin, it's in the
Right now,
south.
I'm
east
tutoring second and third grade in reading
Close to the village, but
at the Wauwatosa
came in
Public
August
Schools.
at the end of
And I have,
and
this is my
so right
7th
here,
year.
it just wasn't there.
I have
I was
5
relocated because of
second
work, so
graders
it's
and
kind of
4
easier.
third graders.
You take what's available.
So I hit about 50,
Yeah.
60 kids so far. I went to the Christmas concert last Tuesday. And
Our kids all went through
they didn't forget my
Turned
ways.
out all right?
They came back to see me.
Nobody's in
and,
the bell tower or anything like that?
No.
Okay, good. Good indicator.
It's wonderful to see the children.
Hello, how are you?
And realizing that that's the future of Wauwatosa and America, you know? And they're just bright ones.
And you had a part of it.
Yeah.
All right, how is everyone this morning?
Good.
Terrific.
Excellent. I hear that God prepares these snowstorms to test who are the righteous and who are not. So congratulations. Yeah. And my wife told me I should can what I had presented and make it more informal and interactive. So I can. I've got a lot of stuff I'm going to try to make work on my computer today, and you can watch me struggle through that. But I can also go off target. But before I get started, just a few caveats about what I'm going to share with you today. Number one, I'm not an expert in what I'm talking about, and we'll all share about where we are on the continuum on this particular issue in just a minute. But and number two, I tend to prepare a lot of stuff because I'm deathly afraid I'm going to run out of things to say. So if you talk, that'll fill all that, and we can avoid some of the stuff that I was going to go through, which will be a lot better anyway. Number two, what I'm going to present is not the way I would normally do things. It's going to be a lot more things prepared by other people that I'm going to share with you. Some might call that cheating, but I'm hoping it's actually a live example of what the sharing economy is all about. So even some of the tools that I use, like there's going to be a couple of SlideShare presentations. If you're not familiar, SlideShare has been around for a number of years. It's essentially a PowerPoint site where people who make other presentations can put them in a format that's somewhat standardized and share them with other people freely to use. In this particular case, there was one I was just looking at before I started where they shared it, but they also controlled how they shared it. They allowed me to present it online, but not to download it on my machine to make me more comfortable that it was going to actually work. But that's part of what sharing is. You get to participate in that community and sometimes set the rules.
Is that an off-site location that you said they shared it with you and you interacted with them, but they wouldn't let you copy it?
Correct.
So is it live on, was kind of some kind of a server or something?
Right, so it's at the SlideShare website, if you want to call it that.
I see.
And so we can go through the network here and go and look at it, but I can't download it to my particular device I've got right here. The sharing experience is what I mentioned before. Jump in at any time with any questions that you have, or if you're not understanding it, because some of this is new to me, and I'm guessing it'll be new to you as well. Also, I'm just going to, this is sort of like a survey course type of presentation. I'm just going to skim across a whole bunch of things rather quickly, and it's not even going to cover lots of areas of what the sharing economy is all about. It's stretching into all aspects of life. In fact, I'm not going to cover it all, a certain segment of it having to do with information sharing and sharing of research, which is actually closest to my particular profession. I'm a director of a university library, and if any of you are familiar with Creative Commons, for instance, which is the sort of the open sharing version of copyright. Copyright comes from the traditional ownership world, where you own something, you label it as yours, you have certain rights over it. Well, that concept of copyright is being changed in many different ways, but one of them is by a project called the Creative Commons, where you can make your the information that you creatively make more open to the world, and you can set some of the requirements for how people use that. Research itself is becoming a lot more shared and open. They again go to a shared site where they put their research in, they combine it with other people, they make it freely available. They create not only research that is shared, as in like articles, people have been doing that for a long time, but actually the data behind the research that they're doing they can share as well. Make that data available for other researchers to use as well. I'm not going to cover any of that. So we haven't even gotten to the beginning yet. And lastly, I just want to make sure you realize the reason why I thought this particular topic might be useful as an adult ed. Because as Dan Weiss said a few weeks ago, most of what I'm going to share today is going to be in the secular frame, as he called it, in the world that we live every day, the practical things. But it does have, I believe, a ethical, at least if not a spiritual dimension. And that is that underlying all of these things, and we'll get to that towards the end of the presentation, is a change in the way that humans interact, build products, create things, send them to other people. And in the traditional world, we put those into things like organizations who control them through laws and regulations and things like that, and that's how we interacted. In this world, each of us are sharing with each other. And what's more fascinating is we're sharing with not us sitting in this room together, we're sharing with people halfway across the globe that we've never met and we will never meet in person. And we may be sharing parts about ourselves, we may be sharing the things that we create, and we have to do that, and that requires a level of trust that is beyond what human systems have previously allowed. I mean, we don't trust each other enough to do those kinds of things. And you're going to hear during one little piece, if it works, some young entrepreneurs talk about how trust works in the businesses they've created and in the transactions that they present. And you'll hear one young woman talk about how she has gotten to the point with the experience that she's had where she can trust people she doesn't know as much, if not even more, which is kind of counterintuitive. But that sort of underlies this whole thing. And as Christians and as a community of people who are hopeful, who believe in God, and therefore who give of themselves more openly, the challenge is to us, fundamentally, is that this culture is happening out there in the secular world, and it is demanding a level of human trust, and they actually have words for trust capital, or out there that go even beyond what a lot of Christian communities have been able to do in the past. So that's really the challenge that underlies all this. But now we're going to go and talk about some specific things. But before we do, how many of you know what the sharing economy is and participate in it? Raise your hand if you do. How many of you have a right hand? Raise it. Sure. Okay. So what part do you participate in?
Well, I professionally, I work I do macroeconomic analysis, and my job is to share intelligence throughout an entire organization within my business organization, but also I've reached outside of my core business to other businesses and other professionals like me who are doing similar work, who aren't competitors, that I feel free sharing what I have, and then they give back to me best practices that they've had. So it's a collaborative community that I just sort of naturally work in.
Right.
The only line I draw is that I don't share with direct competitors.
Right. Well, there's many different levels of that. So one of the core things about any kind of fundamental societal change is it's completely new, and yet at the same time, it's a lot the same. So, I mean, sharing has always been around in some forms. You can share among a small group, you can share within your company, but we're talking about here is sharing beyond those borders. I was just at a meeting earlier this week with a company that I work with, but they're a company built on open source software, and they're about to unveil something that is actually going to show some of their code and functional capabilities to their entire marketplace, which goes, well beyond what the kind of sharing that we normally would consider acceptable. So I know that some of you people do sharing. How many of you have ever run a rummage sale, for instance? Yeah. Right. So there's levels of sharing that we've all participated in, but we're going to go a little bit beyond that. So let's start with a definition just to confuse everybody. And we're going to go to Wikipedia. What is Wikipedia but another sharing tool where people describe things based on a bunch of people deciding how they're going to describe things. So here's what they say about the sharing economy. And it comes under many phrases. If you heard the word collaborative economy, shared economy, is a sustainable economic system built around the sharing of human and physical assets. It includes shared creation, production, distribution, trade, consumption, the whole cycle of goods and services by different people and organizations. Between people, people to organizations, organizations to organizations, all of those options. These systems take a variety of forms, but all leverage information technology. We'll get back to that in a minute in terms of how this movement got started. To empower individuals, corporations, nonprofits, governments with information that enables the distribution, sharing, and reuse of excess capacity of goods and services. That's one of the key elements. One of the things that the sharing economy is really trying to do is saying, in an ownership world, somebody owns something. I own this cup, and I'm drinking tea out of it right now. Then I'm going to set it down and I'm going to start talking to you over here. While I'm talking, that cup is being unused. That's unused capacity. And in a world where there's lots of ownership, unused capacity, what if somebody else can use my cup of tea while I'm over here? Well, that's not probably a good example because I've already touched it and you probably don't want to. But there are plenty of examples of that, including people who, for instance, have started businesses where they make food within their own home and share it with other people in other homes, or invite people into their homes to eat, and we'll hear about one of those. So that's what we're talking about with the shared economy.
Would one example be this, in communities where you can put a quarter in the slot and rent a bike for an hour?
Yes, in fact, that's a great example, because in the Tosa Now paper on the headline this last week on Thursday, there was a lead article about a possible bike sharing operation that they might try to start up right here in Wauwatosa. That's a perfect example of that. Transportation has been one of the huge sectors that's been affected by the sharing economy thus far. One easy way to look at it is to look at what are the classics of the American dream, ownership dream. You know, these kinds of things, the big house in the suburbs, the house itself, all the accoutrements that go with it, the transportation vehicles, the things that go into the house, including your pets and the clothes that you wear and the devices that you use, the instrument that your kid is playing in the high school band. All of those things have the same kind of unused capacity that I mentioned before, and every one of those things is being shared right now in the sharing economy. And I mean everything down to the couch that you watch your Packer game at. You can rent out to other people who might be traveling through town and just need a place to stay overnight. You can share your clothes, the handbags, in a gift exchange. You can have somebody who can walk your dog, or you can offer to walk other people's dog on your block. A lot of these sharing exchanges actually work within local communities where you're essentially doing odd jobs for other people. TaskRabbit is a big service that involves people that are doing that. And in a world in which lots of people are unemployed or underemployed, you can just imagine the possibilities that this kind of economy can present for people. So that's great if you're willing to do all of those things, but if you've grown up in an ownership world and you look at your own house and your own stuff, it takes a little bit of doing to think about how you might change your sense of ownership to allow other people to use your stuff and for you to use theirs. So let's hear just
David,
a...
could I
Yep.
ask a clarifying question, just since we're defining terms here? My idea of sharing...
Not so long ago.
My idea of sharing doesn't necessarily involve the exchange of money. For example, I have a lot of tools.
Right.
It's kind of a bad habit of mine.
Yep.
And for my neighborhood, they
It's a
come
big
to
one.
me and say, hey, can I borrow whatever?
Yeah.
I don't charge them anything for the tool. That's my idea of sharing.
Right.
What you just showed me seems like renting.
Well, there's
Renting your
both
stuff.
There's both sharing excess capacity for a price, and there's also direct one-on-one sharing. There's multiple
still talking about
models.
both?
I'm talking about both of
Okay.
those things.
Okay.
Yeah. And there's ones done directly by individuals, with individuals, and there's ones that are done by institutions or companies or what have you, where the prime motivator is still related to the kind of the ownership world. In other words, I'm getting a deal on it.
Yep.
And there's also just the pure sharing. I like you, you like me, let's share stuff.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, David, the mindset requires for that to happen, it has to be based on trust.
Yes, it does. Lots of it, because
Yeah.
when we share a cup of sugar or a tool with a neighbor, that's one thing, but we're talking about sharing with people that you don't know. I got a question here and then I'll go back.
Well, a comment. I was fortunate enough to go to a workshop this past summer by Eric Law. I don't know if you're familiar with him,
No.
but he talks about this, but in different language, more in sustainable ministry
Mhm.
kind of language. And he focuses on what he calls the cycle of blessings, and he identifies 6 sort of gifts that organizations have that each needs to be moving and flowing in order for an organization to be sustainable. And so money is only one of those resources, but all of it exchanges back and forth and has value. So for your point with sharing is it's all sharing and exchanging and kind of flowing like a river if there are no blockages, and nothing is allowed to remain stagnant. So for instance, in that particular model, it's, you know, relationship, time and place, can't think what I'll say. Money is one of them, but money is sort of the last one. So it's really exciting to see, like, when you start thinking in terms of that, like, that every interaction is an exchange. The creativity is just explosive. It's amazing.
And sustainability is one of the core ethics behind this whole movement. It started with a lot of kind of reuse, recycle, you know, product sustainability, but it sort of has gone beyond that as well. Yeah.
I was just going to comment too, besides the couch surfing, like when Harley had its weekend, and one of our neighbors, she left her house, turned it over to some Canadians, and it was, you know, certainly a lot of trust there. She had never met these people, and she was renting out her house and even walking away from it where she wasn't even there at the time.
Right. So I mean, people have been doing, again, elements of a lot of these things. You know, there's been timeshares where you essentially have a partial ownership in something and you're sharing part of your time with another person, but it hasn't been always your primary residence. And if we have time towards the end, we'll talk about some of the early incidents in the last couple of years where things have gone wrong with the trust part of the equation. And but the system itself is developing, again, new, you know, kind of global web-based tools to try to solve that problem by creating systems that identify how trustworthy you are. And in fact, Rachel Botsman, her stuff was too long, so I didn't bring that today, but she's one of the gurus. Her whole research is on the trust economy and the reputation capital, as she calls it, because the real value in the sharing economy is precisely that. It's your reputation. If it's high, then you are going to be a lot more capable of getting and doing things, of moving around in that space, than if you get a bad reputation. And if you do, the computer systems are very good at tracking that and having it follow you. So,
our 2 children both live in, one lives in San Diego and one lives in Chicago, and there's a new taxi cab type business on the internet where you can, and they rate each driver, so the trust factor is built in there. If someone gets a bad rating because they, then they don't get any rides, but people are just using their cars, you just call them up and they'll come pick you up and take you somewhere.
right. And by taxi cab, we mean there's services involving more traditional taxi cab companies, but there's also true sharing taxi cabs, which is just people in their own cars who are, you know, you can get an app that shows you where they are and if they're close by and if they're reliable, and then you say yes, and then they show up at the curb and you get a ride and away you go. So one of the upsides of this whole movement is, in addition to the product or service that you're getting, is it connects you to people, and not all virtual things, real things, you know, a real person who's driving you around town. So here, let's listen to a little 5-minute intro on what we're talking about.
For the weekend, your choices were places ranging from the Four Seasons to Motel 6, and renting a car meant dealerships like Hertz or Avis. Of course, you could still use those companies, but you might also just deal with a person like yourself. Thousands of Americans have started renting out their personal assets online to earn extra cash. They rent their apartments while they're away for the weekend, lend their cars for cash, even sell their spare time. It's called the peer-to-peer economy, or the sharing economy. NPR's Steve Henn explains all this is possible in part because of technology, but also because many Americans are coming to terms with scarcity in their lives.
Sharing is not new. After all, eBay has been around for a while, and the Craigslist auction of unwanted junk is more or less a staple of modern life. Still, during the financial crisis, something began to change.
Absolutely. When the crisis hit, there were people who were in desperate need of alternative solutions.
Nathan Belcharsek is one of the co-founders of Airbnb.
We were one of those solutions.
For the uninitiated, Airbnb allows anyone with a house or an apartment to compete head-to-head against the likes of Hilton in the tourist trade. The website allows you to rent your place out online when you're out of town. You can even rent out a spare room. In 2009, as the economy collapsed and this company was getting off the ground, that became a godsend for some.
The Airbnb income pays our mortgage for us.
Michael Beard and his wife started renting out rooms in their house near Washington during President Obama's first inauguration.
A little bit later, I wound up losing my job as an arts administrator for a very high-profile performing arts school.
They have a big old house and a blended family. Together, they've raised 10 kids. Initially, opening up their home this way was a decision driven by necessity.
There's a lot of barriers that people have to break through to do something like this.
Renting out a home, your home, for the weekend on the internet to complete strangers is kind of a radical idea. Lisa Gansky is a serial entrepreneur, investor, and the author of Mesh, a book about the sharing economy. She says the financial crisis helped make this kind of cultural shift possible. She calls it our culture's blue dye moment.
The idea where you inject blue dye into a system and you can suddenly see things in new ways that weren't visible before.
She says the stress of the Great Recession allowed millions of Americans to see the waste and the excess in their own lives more clearly. Gansky says mobile technology made sharing all sorts of things much simpler.
In the same way that a taxi illuminates when they're on and off duty, we have this ability to suddenly illuminate what is waste, what is sitting around unused, and that pent-up waste is, with new eyes, becomes value.
And businesses that link people together this way are proliferating. Lending Club lets consumers lend directly to one another. It will facilitate $2 billion in consumer loans this year. And last weekend, a handful of chefs in New York, San Francisco, and Washington, D.C. invited strangers into their own homes for dinner. Noah Koresh helped make this possible by founding
Feastly, so this marketplace that allows any chef to offer and serve a meal to any hungry eater.
He got this idea on a trip to Guatemala after spending a long, fruitless afternoon searching for authentic local food.
And so as we were walking back to where we were staying, like deflated and hungry, we came across this young avocado seller named Erwin, and he asked him, hey, do you know where we can find some Guatemalan food, just like last-ditch effort? And he paused for a second, and then he looked up at us. Massive smile on his face, and was like, yeah, my mom's house. And we were really excited about that, and so we followed him back to his house. He swings open the door, and there's his mom, Rosa, making the most amazing Guatemalan food. And as we were there interacting with them, the biggest thought that came through my head was, why was it so hard? Why was it so hard for me to find this authentic food, and why was it so hard for Rosa to be able to showcase what she loved to do and maybe make some extra income doing it?
Building a solution to this problem became Feastly. But as peer-to-peer businesses roll into sector after sector of the old school economy, regulators and entrenched industries are rebelling. Sharing advocates like Lisa Gansky argue that as the Earth's population heads towards 9 billion, these kinds of businesses offer a solution. She says governments will need to adapt to peer-based businesses and give them room to work. They're more efficient, she argues. They eliminate waste and provide opportunities for millions of us to make a little extra money. But best of all, Gansky, these businesses help connect us to each other. Steve Henn, NPR News, Silicon Valley.
All right, a couple things. So we heard about Airbnb, which is sort of like the poster child for the sharing economies. Started early in the game, providing people places to stay all around the world. Feastly is in the other category, of the whole food category of people who are preparing and sharing food directly with each other. It's also illustrative of one other aspect of this economy, which is both exciting and troubling, and that is that it's highly technology enabled. So even though he told the nice story about being in Guatemala and being lucky enough to find the person on the street who told him he could go to mom's house and get the food, the way these services mostly work in the way that they can expand out from just the small circle of people that you normally hang out with is through technology. And if you're really poor or live in certain parts of the world, those tools may not be available to you, and the benefits of all of this may not be available to you as well. All right, so what caused this? What are the underlying... before, as far as definition, you're asking the different kinds. There's peer-to-peer, directly one individual helping another individual. Crowdsourcing is another whole category. You're familiar, especially in the funding area. There's lots of tools out there that allow you to bypass normal investment world and instead have people with ideas that they need money for, and they can just go out there and ask other people to give them money, and even though they don't know them or they don't know how to invest, they can give somebody $100, they can pool it all together, and they have a stake in what somebody's venture is. There's online marketplaces run by companies, and there's lots of purchasing platforms as well. So what are the things that help this process to get started? Well, in the left box there is, first there's economic factors that really caused this to happen. It really accelerated with the Great Recession. So with the advent of lots of, essentially the lost generation, my kids' generation, who are coming out of school with much more difficult job prospects, but they're very connected. And they were already sharing things with each other, with their friends on the cell phone. They had the early nascent technological tools like Facebook, where they were connecting and with the wants and needs of each other's. And they also were not getting a job, and they didn't have the normal ways of getting a bunch of money and then buying things like their car and their house and other things like that. So instead, they're sharing things. The second thing is the technology, which I mentioned before. The internet goes global. Not only is it available, but it's available on your mobile platform, so you can have services that are available not only in your home, but as you're walking around on the street. And then the second phase of that, which is only at the beginning, which is not just the technology, but the data and the systems for allowing people to do things behind them, especially with regards to finance and how people share, create money, and even what money means, because in the sharing economy, you can actually create your own kinds of money, which we won't have time to talk much about today. And then lastly is the couple of other social factors, which include increased population density. A much larger percentage of the human population are living in cities, increasingly with each year, so that the possibilities for even, as they call it, offline as well as online sharing, where you actually have to give the tool to somebody else, are much more possible when people are in dense environments. And it's also much easier to share things like a car if you live in an urban area, because you're not as likely to need that for long trips to the farm or wherever it is. I mean, you just need it to run to the grocery store or to go to the job twice a week, where you can borrow somebody else's car. So those are some of the factors that help all of this come in together. All right. So let's look at some examples. What are these ventures that we're talking about? Right. We're going to skip over this part here and go right to the examples. So here's just a smattering of them. You could spend a few hours just going through all of it. And one of the things that goes with the sharing economy is, even though like Airbnb is like the one of the big names in the sharing economy. Probably most of you may not have heard of them before. And because it's so easy to start a venture online, there are thousands of them. And it's impossible to even know what all the companies are. It's not like just getting a car and knowing you got Ford and GM and Chrysler and a few options. There are tons of options out there. So one of the first areas was in some of the core areas of life, food and shelter. So some of the big names are Airbnb, which is just what it says, which is you go over the airwaves and you get your own bed and breakfast by saying that you want to rent somebody else's place and they want to rent yours. It doesn't have to be a one-on-one thing where you're sharing back and forth. It can be just a trip. The other two they mention here are 9flats.com and House Trip. I know there's lots more in this category. Banks. And we're going to spend just a minute on the financial part because I think that's one of the more transformative parts of this whole area. But there's the Lending Club is a big one. Crowdsource funding I mentioned before. Crowding in is another one that's a big player in this marketplace.
So are these regulated in the same way?
Well, we probably won't have a lot of time to talk about that, but that's part of the if not the dark side, it's part of the unfinished business of the sharing economy at this point. And typical to many kind of disruptive elements, a lot of these ventures have been allowed to start and get going without a lot of regulation because they sort of flew under the radar, and a number of them are now bumping up against the kinds of problems that require some regulation. And so the answer is yes and no to that. Some of them have to follow the rules that other banks and lenders would do, but some of them don't. And some of the reasons is because it crosses that gray line. When if you go to a bank, there's rules about what they can do with the money, but if you loan to your brother, that is an unregulated market. And some of these sharing economy tools literally started as extensions of sharing with your brother. It's just not your brother. And so there's lots of wrangling going on that particular topic.
Well, I see that there's a large shadow banking system in China of rogue banks that are not regulated and it's one of the biggest risks in the Chinese economy are these rogue banking systems that could collapse with lots of assets at play.
Mm-hmm.
If that's happening here in the U.S., then it's a risk.
It's a definite risk, yeah.
But I would be curious to know to what degree. I mean, is that a tenth of a percent of the lending that goes on? I mean, is it so microscopic now that it's not a risk?
I'm sure, I don't know what the exact number is, but yes, it's a very, very small fraction at this point. Growing rapidly, but it's still a small fraction at this point. Cars are another big area. There's been things like zip cars around for a while where you can rent a small car. I remember reading years ago, Portland was a big city that started with car sharing earlier than other places around the country. But now there's lots of different versions of car sharing out there, from a company type model, which were the original ones that essentially were sort of rental on the go, to ones where, again, it's more peer-to-peer car sharing, where you're either sharing a car with somebody else that's been left on the street, literally, that you pick up and drive, or the ride sharing itself, which is a version of classic carpooling to work, where somebody is offering not only their car, but their driving services, which you can share with other people. Lots of options in this area of the market. Even every element of how you use a car. So I find this one kind of fascinating. So if you had gone for a trip to Florida for a week, and you leave Milwaukee, you fly to Florida, you leave your car in the parking lot here at Mitchell Field, you rent a car down in Florida, you come home, you drive your personal car home. But what if, while your car is just sitting there idle here in the parking lot at Mitchell Field, somebody else could drive your car around Milwaukee while you're down in Florida, and you could make a few bucks off of your trip. No problem, right? Well, people are doing that right now. Ride sharing, we already covered. Even the aspect of parking. So parking places. Well, I mean, what's more important to people that live in urban areas, for instance, than having a place to park? But even in places where you do have a space. What if you could rent out a portion of your driveway, which you're not using, to somebody else who needs to get their car in because they're visiting Aunt Mabel down the street? You can do that as well. And this is typical of a service that, you know, sort of makes sense. I guess I could do that. That's not like inviting them into my home. But how the heck would you connect up with some random person from Fargo who's visiting to rent your part of your driveway for a few days? Well, that's where the technology part comes in, because it makes it much easier for people to connect with people. And then you get down to individual goods. There's lots of clothing, there's swapping exchanges, there's gifting exchanges, there's, and this ties into one of the other sort of interesting and problematic parts of this economy, is that part of that excess capacity idea is not just that people, like a young person who doesn't have a full-time job, can sort of survive using some of these tools, but it also provides the opportunity for some people to get higher priced or more luxury or other items, because instead of buying their own personal handbag, which they don't use that often except for that junky one they take to work, instead they can rent out the Gucci bag for those 3 big events of the season from somebody else and go there and look, you know, like they're really happening, you know. So, I mean, this touches people on all parts of the market. Clothing, taxis, we already talked about. Lots of just online versions of what we talked about before with rummage sales, ways for people to share all the stuff that they own. Even things like art. There are art swapping services. There are services to probably, most of these are for, you know, taking care of somebody else's dog, but I'm sure there's probably some for if you're starved for dog attention, you can probably borrow somebody's dog. Bike sharing, Tom, is where you mentioned before, and there's lots of things that have been around with bike sharing for a while. Other items like your boats, your toys, and even your tasks, even in the places where, so there's, this is an especially interesting one for, again, people who are on the outside of full employment. There are lots of ways where you can offer services, both trained professional intellectual services and just your physical labor through a lot of these exchange services. TaskRabbit is one of the most well-known ones. You can also share the places where you work. There's lots of sharing economy services out there for office space. So instead of just, again, owning, your company owning its own space, which every company will tell you, you know, how much time your machine, your PC is being used, you know, so there's services for allowing other people to use cycles off your machine when it isn't being used. There's also services out there that allow other people to come in and use your office space when you're not using it. And meals. Here's a big one for St. Matthew's. We're already in the meal sharing program or services already. Again, a way to get outside of the regular economy where you go to a restaurant or to the food store. Instead, you're sharing directly with other people either the meals you make or the meals you eat. You can also share the Wi-Fi that you have. How many times have people done that just illegal? I'm not sure how this one actually works, but apparently there are people who are sharing their Wi-Fi as well. So those just give you a sort of a smattering example of some of the things that are happening out there. If you want to see, there's another place here, the Mesh, which was mentioned in the NPR story before. They have a website where they categorize all this stuff, so if you wanted to go and find sharing services in any one of these categories, you could just go and anybody want me to pick one? Are you interested? Book sharing, it's a big one. different sharing sites there are. This is part of the downside of all this is who has the time to go and track all these things down and figure out which one they're going to use. Yeah.
In the book sharing area, just in the last year, the proliferation you see around Tulsa of the little libraries and that people share libraries have on the edge of their property, and that you just come take a book. And
that's an offline version of the same idea, isn't it? Yeah. Let's keep moving on. So I'm going to try to get this one in because I've got a few other things I want to do, but there's one other video I want to show you, and I just want to set it up a little bit because I think it captures a little bit of the mood that goes with this movement as well. So you're going to see a lot of people, each of them are a founder of a sharing economy venture of some kind, but they've been asked specifically to talk about the future of money, because one of the other elements that has to go with this kind of sharing is a different way, a different thought about what money is, how it works, and you're going to hear lots of more grandiose ideas here, but it captures, I think, part of the vibe of what this movement is about, and they may use a lot of words like super awesome and things like that, so just be prepared in advance because that's what those people do. Right. Let's see if we can get this out. And I apologize before, was it with the sound on that, and was that kind of, it's probably just the wireless.
We can go online in the space of 10 seconds. We have 20 tabs with amazing initiatives and amazing people all around the world. It naturally raises my standards and raises my expectations in terms of what I can achieve. And when I see all this stuff, it's sort of this feeling of overwhelming, what the hell would I do with this? On the other hand, when I'm clear, it's just this complete bliss and ecstasy that there's just so much richness. And to talk about wealth, I feel like I have the world's collective consciousness at my fingertips, and I just feel so rich.
A lot of us had parents that were baby boomers and potentially disillusioned hippies. They supported our creative side, and somehow we caught their idealism, and now we're interested in the structure of money.
I think it's going to be really incumbent upon those of us for whom digital technology is more natural to invent the systems of the future.
I can't imagine how many great ideas out there are buried in the backs of the minds of people, of young students with a lot of debt who just don't have the ability to pursue them. It's like shackling our innovators.
When you base lending and credit on things like a natural history of cosigners, those things exclude millions of people around the world who don't have them. However, everyone has potential, and if you can base credit on future potential, that leads a lot more people into financial inclusion.
It's actually not a question that you pay for what you already got. You actually pay for what you will get, the things that can be made because you paid.
I think one of the things that's going on right now is a re-examination of value and of wealth and of assets and of a lot of words that have a lot to do with money but really aren't about money.
Money itself seems to be a mystery for most people. It is just so shockingly alien to you if you compare it for how many decades you were using it until you are questioning yourself for the first time what it really is.
We give in money the properties of the divine. You know, money is not wealth. Money is potential wealth. But we give it such power that it influences the way we feel about ourselves.
By experiencing a complementary system, I changed my notion of wealth.
People need to see themselves more as producers. And if they see themselves as producers, they can also see that they create a value and that's probably someone out there who can benefit from that value.
There is actually a direct link between the kind of new social habits we are learning online and the social movement which is created.
We're more willing to connect with someone who we've only seen a a profile of online and to trust them in real space or with our time. I would share almost all of my information with complete strangers because I feel there's an integrity to the way I live, and it's fine for other people to know about that.
As we work together creating these collective projects, then trust naturally comes from that. And out of that trust, we then seek to organize new forms of social life. So trust is at the basis of the recreation of real communities which are no longer bounded by place, but are bounded by shared values.
You put yourself in a more vulnerable state when you express what you need. We go out and we buy it from people we don't know, but we don't turn to our community. Putting all that information into one database creates an enormous amount of potential energy. When you know what a community needs, you know what the market demand is.
So if there was a kind of bank that allowed me to convert my money to a local currency right now, I would do that.
Successful businesses and other non-business organizations of the future will have to be more transparent and more human. And the ones that succeed in the long run, I think, are going to come back more as peers in our society so that they can behave in trustworthy ways rather than trying to tell us over and over again to trust them.
Banks are going to have to evolve to meet the new business models around mediated trust in communities. And the ones that do are going to survive and take on a very different role. And the ones that don't, I think, are just going to go out of business.
Try to start and think in new ways. During the discussion, like this discussion on what's to come and what is value and what could replace money.
It's more about creating an atmosphere within a company or organization that allows the people who work there to speak out crazy ideas without being fired right away.
Think about the first days of aviation. The Wright brothers would say, okay, let's make these things fly. And they would think about huge infrastructure that is needed, airports and embassies and people on security. And all these are huge opportunities.
The bank, again, is not an external entity to the community, but is an expression of the community itself.
What are the kinds of flows that we want to see? What is that we want to shape? What is that we want to measure? And then try to design currencies for that.
Think about currency as open to the principles of the free market. Just as corporations are free to compete for various value-creating opportunities, currencies should be free to compete. Different currency models competing against one another for their ability to serve different purposes.
We're starting to reconsider how the commercial economy intersects with gift exchange and the commons. And no business likes to hear that something of what they're doing might fall into the commons or might be a gift, might be very cheap to do or easy to do, but they are. It is. And if you actually have your eyes open and look at those forces and understand them deeply, you will see new business opportunities around the commons, contributing to the commons, being in a symbiotic relationship with the commons that are different from the way we used to do business.
And I do think that there's a great money-making opportunity in currency innovation, so that rather than simply innovating in terms of the financial instruments built on top of the current currency system, you go underneath and actually develop new operating systems.
That blow your mind a little bit?
Yeah. You go underneath.
Question?
Yeah.
Are bitcoins part of all that?
Yes.
I totally don't understand that.
Early a venture at a currency. I think they just hit a big marker recently. $1 million or something like that, or something
from
like
trading at $1,000 a coin down to 485 this past week.
Did it
crashed
well,
again?
because it
it
had a speculative
it's a
bubble.
Ponzi system where libertarians take money from each other. It's like going and playing poker with your buddies. It's not a real money system.
Yeah. So what is interesting though is just to capture the flavor of the as you go beyond individual business ventures there, the idea of when you're sharing directly between individuals instead of through an organization, where the kind of the thought process can go. And these are people who are shared that. And I just want to get back to that idea of trust here in the few minutes that we have left, and a few of the issues that have already been raised. And I'm going to skip through a few of those.
Can I comment?
Yep.
I hope you'll correct me if I'm misinterpreting, but from that clip you showed us, I sort of got the impression that people can choose they feel like they want to choose what they use as currency. Okay, what they value in trust, they want to use as currency. Okay, so if they want to trade their time and barter a bag of grain or whatever, great. You know, and I think we're allowed to do that, but we also have to have a currency that's based on something. You know, it's based on the sovereignty of a country. It's based on, you know, it's backed. You can't have, if you don't have unbacked currencies, then they don't last very long. But the trading and sharing community accommodates that, as long as it's quid pro quo, as long as something real is being given in exchange for something else. Even if it's something as real as, I'm giving you this because it makes me feel good, fine, that's your currency. But it's not, you can't put that in the bank. You can't always go buy groceries with that.
Right, and I think one of the things, I think if you had enough time to listen to that, and I'm not here to either advocate for or against, I'm just presenting here, but one thing is true, is that some of these more radical ideas are meant to be actually confrontational to the current system, but part of them are meant to be to cohabitate with the current system as well. So like you said, there's always been a place for non-monetary human transactions. There's been barter clubs and stuff like that around. You know, local businesses will do, you know, trading of products and customers and stuff like that. Those things have been around for a long time. It's just the technology makes it easier to share those in a broader context. But they're not, some of them can be complementary to the existing system, and some are not. And some of our largest businesses are also capturing some of these ideas and incorporating them into their business practices as well. And one of the core fundamental, kind of really fundamental economic questions, even beyond the money, is what happens when you're stopped being employed by your employer, which is your bread and butter, and instead somebody else is doing part of what you're doing through the sharing economy, and then you don't have your job, but that's how they're getting their job when they don't have a job, and nobody's figured that at that level what's happening in terms of how they work. And all we know is that we're in like one of those historical moments of either a flux, and all of this stuff is happening. All the traditional economy is happening, and all of this stuff is happening at the same time. But
you know, David, the spectrum that we're really talking about is, on the very primitive side, is you speak about a bushel of grain. Well, that's a barter, sort of a barter type economy, all the way to, say, derivatives in the financial market, which is a highly sophisticated end of things. And so we all sort of, we choose how we fit in that spectrum, right, based upon our needs and our capacity and the trust that we have.
Right.
Yeah, the risk there is that individuals are at risk, because when you have this informal system that's not regulated, and someone tells you something has value, and it turns out it doesn't.
Yes.
So you as an individual in this informal system don't have the same protections and
correct.
And it can be risky.
And I think you hit the nail on that. One of the things I find fascinating about it is it's a common space where kind of liberal and conservative libertarianism with technology laced in all can run free, because it provides for a whole bunch of people to try different things. So here's an example. This was a big a thing where a guy in UK was using Airbnb regularly, and not only had a bad experience, but he had like his entire personal identity and his house completely gutted while he was gone for a week by somebody who he thought in the system he could trust. So these kinds of companies who are in their infancy are attempting to try to deal with that situation. So they're using a lot of traditional ways to do that. offering guarantees to cover for that, you know, connecting people to services to help them with dealing with troubleshooting issues that happen. But more importantly, they're moving towards these reputation systems that are supposed to increase your ability to trust people through these transactions. Some of those have been out there, your Facebook profile, for instance, and versions of that are going to be expanded into ever larger things called a social graph. In fact, in the Rachel Botsman, her presentation at the end of it, she shows her dream, which is kind of either a great trusting device, or it's a libertarian, or for non-libertarian nightmare, because she proposes this kind of central place where all the information about you, actually I don't even know if it's kind of anti-libertarian in a way, because it's sort of putting all the information about you into one place where your reputation will be shown to the world or something like that, which is like either really great because it helps you know about that person you're dealing with over there, but then when you think about it yourself, it's like, oh my God, do I really want that or not? So all sorts of ways, of course, computers can do track what your activities are to try to build that reputation. There's new insurance vehicles that are being created to try to cover for your reputation in case it doesn't work out too well. But the one I really want to get to amongst the various tools is, yeah, these are all traditional, is companies like Trust Cloud, which are reputation systems, which are being built specifically to track and build your reputation in the sharing economy. These are the tools that are going to prove whether you your reputation balance or your reputation value in this marketplace, which is so key to what's going on.
So there's going to be an algorithm that cranks this out, similar to a credit rating?
Yes, and I control that algorithm.
Right.
How do you feel
right.
about
Who's
deciding what? But I'm a nice guy. Come on.
Right. Are we turning it over to the computer, who has some design that you know,
yeah.
Takes the whole landscape and translates it into what you're. I mean, credit ratings.
As we know,
I'm not defending credit ratings; they're flawed also.
Yeah.
So.
As we know, big data is out there, and it's being used by various agencies to track our credit ratings or other aspects of our daily lives. So, whether it's done by a government or by a corporation or by this kind of a service, it is increasingly part of our lives. So in this case, it's just showing you how this kind of area of life is trying to utilize that to deal with one of the biggest issues it has, which is if you're going to work with people across the globe, how do you trust them? And the same computers that connect you to them are going to offer you a service to help you determine whether you can trust them or not. So do you trust them? That's why I made the presentation as a question mark. It's very much a new area of our economic existence. It has lots of other issues. I didn't get to that part in my presentation, but there are all the ones that you might imagine in terms of regulating activity like this.
I'm just curious. Our culture is getting more divided. The rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer. The poor in this kind of sharing economy doesn't have a place.
That's one of the items that I would have had on the list, yes. I mean, it is and it isn't. I mean, it's a mixed bag. It does allow for sharing of things for people who don't have as much, but probably in particular, it's really well tuned for, you know, urban living, college educated, don't yet have a full-time job young people. It works really kind of sort of well for them, but for the truly poor and who don't have the resources to even connect, it doesn't help at all.
One of the areas
that excess capacity you're sharing, they don't have.
One of the areas I know firsthand where that does actually kind of step in to help the poorest of the poor is in fair trade. Mm-hmm. And you know, with the example of Third World Handcraft Shop, mm-hmm. they made the connection at one point to say there are these artisans all over the world who make beautiful stuff, yes. but no one in their countries can afford to buy it. There are people here with the expendable income. Let's connect the two, and that's how that business and that model came to.
Yeah. we're over time here, so I don't want to keep you any longer. If you have any other questions afterwards, I'd be glad to answer them. Thanks for spending some time.
Thank you, Dave.